Hi, Professor Yeidy Rivero. How are you today?
Hi, Luisa. I'm great, thanks. And you?
That's good. I'm good. I'm very excited for our conversation today. So, you're currently chair of the Department of Film, Television, and Media, but you also teach in the Department of American Culture and Latino Studies. Can you share how these areas intersect with each other?
So, yes, I was hired actually as a joint appointment faculty member 12 years ago when I joined Michigan. I'm now 100%, just to clarify, I'm part of Latino Studies. My appointment right now is 100% in film, television, and media. They're interconnected because, of course, film and media and digital media are extremely important for American cultural studies and Latino studies. So I see that's why I think like when they actually hired me, they thought that it was important to be, to have a connection between both departments. Now I think it's more important, of course, because of the number of the Latinos in Latinx people in the US and how important issues of representation and participation behind the scenes of many Latinx people.
Did you know that you always wanted to go into this field?
No, no.
Was there ever a moment or an experience that led you to want to pursue this?
So my passion is theater and was theater, and that's what I studied. My BA, my master's are in theater. But I think I realized, well, first of all, I realized I love to teach. And second, at the time when I finished my master's, I worked for 4 years. I didn't study, and then I decided to do a PhD. I thought, okay, I think theater is important, it's magnificent, but I think if you want to reach people or one of the mediums that is more important is TV. So I decided to switch, and instead of doing a PhD in theater, I did a PhD in radio, TV, and film at the University of Texas in Austin.
So you did your bachelor's degree at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, and you majored in drama and minored in communication. So kind of the focus in theater, as you just mentioned. Did you notice that there was a difference in what you were studying, the culture around you, student life as a whole, once you moved to mainland United States?
Yes, of course. Like it was a different, well, it's a difference in terms of what you study. So when I was at the University of Puerto Rico, of course, the focus, especially in theater, yes, you study the classics like Greek, I don't know, Roman theater, like classic British theater. US theater, to tell you, we didn't study a lot.
Really?
The majority was Latin American theater.
Mm,
And in terms of my minor was in communication. I did that afterwards, by the way, after I finished my BA. I decided to stay
okay.
one more year. There, theories, of course, US, Europe, you can see more connections to what I later studied in the United States. But in the theater department, not at all. Except the, like theoretical work. But in terms of reading plays, no, different type of plays, different types of focus.
Have you found, and did you find upon reaching the United States, living in New York and in Texas, ways to stay connected with your roots from Puerto Rico?
Well, yeah, my entire family is there. Well, most of my family is there, and my parents were there, so I constantly travel. And my friends, my good friends, are from theater, and many of them are in New York. I have a bunch of friends in New York and a bunch of friends in Puerto Rico. But they're like, again, those are my dearest friends, and they're doing theater. That's my connection.
Wow. So then have you been able to maintain this kind of connection while you're at the University of Michigan now?
So it has been the older you get, the harder it is. Mainly because, like, once in a while when they're like, I don't know, birthday. So of course I connect, I call. If I go to New York City, I see many of them.
Mhm.
But I haven't been able, well, the pandemic, of course, the last time I went to New York was 2019. I haven't been to Puerto Rico in a while. I try, but it has been harder and harder with time, to tell you the truth.
Kind of a change in topics. In the book you co-edited with Arlene Davila, Contemporary Latino Media, Production, Circulation, and Politics, she cited your study of the transnational nature of media from Latin America, connecting the whole of Latin America and Hollywood. Is this something that you have noticed has persisted?
So I think so. It's the work that I did with Cuba. It has to be the work because I wrote a book about Cuban TV in the 50s, and that's when the connection with the U.S. but also with Latin America emerged, especially in the 40s with radio, and then the 50s with TV. Now it's like wait, like now there is no, like it has exploded. Like before, it was mainly networks. Like in the case of Cuba. Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina. So you have networks.
Right.
But now you have networks and you have cable and you have platforms. So all of that, it's extremely difficult to actually keep track of all the connections between the US and Latin America and across Latin America. So I think right now it's more difficult to trace those flows than it used to be before. And I'm mostly a historian, to tell you the truth, a media historian. So I don't focus on the present that often, but I have good friends who focus on that.
Awesome. So then, in your expertise, thinking historically, how would you define Latino media?
So you have Latino media, there is Spanish language media. I'm going to say the Latino media. When I think about Latino media, is media made in the US, produced in the US. If not, I will say Latin American media.
Right.
Or Spanish Caribbean media.
Mm.
I think when you think about Latina media, you think about two types of media. The main difference is language. Spanish language, Latino media, and English language media. So Latino media. So I don't know, a movie produced by Latinos in Hollywood, or Gordita Chronicles. So it's something new that, okay, I will categorize that show as Latino media, Latino TV,
Right.
or One Day at a Time.
That's the one I was going to mention.
And then, of course, in the Spanish language scene, even though it's usually co-produced, like what is produced in Miami, even though it's like with actors through, from all Latin America, or radio shows that are produced in New York, in San Antonio, in New Jersey, you name it. I'm talking about, like radio shows. Like people don't pay attention to that, but they're very popular. All of that. And of course, new media.
Right.
That's all of that is part of Latino media, even though people usually focus on film and TV.
And this idea of Latino media seems to parallel the concept of Latinidad, wherein the audience is not homogeneous. Is it important to highlight the different groups of Latinos and Latinas and Latines when networks and programs make content of them and not necessarily for them? Or is it effective to be general in marketing, word choice, and story coverage?
So for me, it's important to focus on the specificity, even though right now they are trying to, for the most part, it's like pan-ethnicity, like Latinos, regardless of where you are from, etc. First of all, when Latino media, I'm thinking about radio specifically when it began. You have Latino radio or Spanish language radio in the US since the 30s, but I'm talking about like when the market was conceptualized, like in the 60s, they were very clear, like the people producing shows and the advertisers were very, very specific that they wanted to target like Cubans in Miami, not Dominicans yet, but Puerto Ricans in New York, Mexicans in the Southwest. And they actually hire actors who have their specific accents. And the copy was targeted with a slang, like the way of speaking of those specific ethnic groups. Right now, I like that, by the way, because I think accents and the way you speak are key to who you are.
Right.
Okay. But right now in mainstream Spanish language, at least, they focus, they homogenize. What I'm seeing with these shows, like in the English language, media, what I'm seeing, which I think is fabulous, is that they are targeting a specific group of people. So you have Gordita Chronicles, is a Dominican girl and a Dominican family that migrated to the United States, and they have Cuban friends because, of course, they have to have Cuban friends because it's in Miami. So, So they
Right.
did the research, and one day at a time is a Cuban family. People don't think about that when they think about Los Angeles, but they included some Mexican friends, and they talk about immigration and prejudice, etc. So what I'm seeing is that in English language right now, at least in terms of television, there is an effort to actually not homogenize. Even though, of course, the targeting is, like the marketing is for Latinos, but the specificity of the culture, it's incredible that they are focusing on specific ethnic groups instead of saying all Latino. I like
Right.
that.
I mean, yeah, I have noticed that over time. I still haven't seen Gordita Chronicles, but I'm really excited to watch that. So then connecting this kind of concept to student life on campus, I've met quite a few students that have shared that they had not met a Latinx person prior to their arrival to the University of Michigan. This means that the media that they consumed was the only representation that they were exposed to. How does this speak to the need for equitable Latinx representation within the media?
Where are they from? Because
The ones that I've met are from the middle of Michigan.
I know, like, especially in Michigan, there is a humongous Mexican American community.
Absolutely.
So, okay. Um,
I don't know. I'm
I think
speaking from experience.
No, I know. I think representation is important, different stories. And again, I think there is a huge difference between like the 70s and 60s and today. I'm not saying that because the 60s and 70s you could see, I don't know, in Hollywood, it's like the gang member, like this, like, they usually
Mhm.
that now is different. So I think it's like, I think the change that is happening, like this, not like massive, but seeing like entire shows focusing on Latinos, I think that's extremely important for them to open up. Hopefully these young people who have never met a Latino family will be open to the possibility of consuming a show that deals with that different culture. Not that that is a representation of the culture itself. It's a representation. It's not real. It's representation. But at least
Right.
to give them an idea of difference. Who's part of the United States and different
Right.
cultures within the United States.
Right. That transitions perfectly to the fact that in your book, the book that you co-edited, Contemporary Latina, Latino Media, there was a mention of an increase in anti-immigrant media coverage where people that are of the Latinx community are presented as foreign and a threat. Did you specifically experience any of this foreignization and labeling as other upon moving to the mainland?
So not in school, to tell you the
Mm.
truth. I came here to study my master's. I went to Stony Brook in Long Island, and then I went to Texas. So not in the school academic environment. I think my main experience with racism, if you want to call it like that, because that's what it was. It's like I was
Mhm.
in Long Island and I went to a Gap and I had a backpack and I saw a classmate who actually was Puerto Rican from New York.
Mhm.
So we spoke Spanish and she left. And then suddenly someone began to follow me within the Gap and
Mhm.
asked for my backpack. So
Wow.
I remember like that's the first time that I'm like, oh my God. Like I never again, I was 20, I'm gonna say 22, 23.
Mhm.
And I remember leaving the store. And then of course this other person, Jackie was her name. She was still around in the mall, and I was like crying. And then of course she went back to the store,
Mhm.
go, thanks to her, and fought for like insulted them. Was like I'm gonna tell you something, blah, blah, blah.
Right,
Which of
right.
course. But anyway, that's my encounter with prejudice, and I think it was for the first one, and I have seen it. I think there is a thread. The thread is like the language. That's how they
Mhm.
can tell, the first, in my case, they see me and they, if I don't open my mouth, they don't know. As
Mhm.
soon as I open my mouth, everything changes, and all depends how educated the people are. I have
Mhm.
seen people who listen to my accent and they are like speaking so slow. So they, because they think that I don't get them.
Wow.
But that happens to many people. you know.
Right.
In my master's also at Stony Brook, Long Island, I had a Fulbright, like I had a fellowship. So,
Mhm.
I was very lucky and paid for everything. But in addition to that, after a year, I was nominated, like the chair of the department nominated me and another classmate for a fellowship. And the other classmates, a white man. So we were both of us, like we were going to be nominated for this extra fellowship because we were
Mhm.
doing well, blah, blah, blah. And another person who was not nominated told me, well, of course they nominated you because you were a Latina. When in reality, they nominated me because I had excellent grades
Mhm.
and because I was doing very well, like my classmates, the white guy.
Right.
This like prejudice.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's painful, and I cannot even imagine, how are, like young people right now. I actually don't know, especially with I believe that right now the situation is more prevalent, like like what is happening right now, like the politics. I
Yeah.
cannot imagine how young people are going through, like what they're experiencing. Hopefully they are more
Right.
brave than I was because I was like, "Ah." I'm just
We all have our moments. We all have our moments when we need to just cry it out. Right. No, I empathize, and I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Oh, I was
But
young.
look at you now.
I
Look at
know.
you now. You truly, I mean, you're an inspiration now to
Oh,
these
thank you.
students that, no, of course, to these students that possibly are going through the same things. And I mean, you're experiencing these microaggressions that are just horrible to experience, to hear, or to ever endure. So it's great that you did make it through, and now you're able to say, look, mírame ahora. So when it comes to your research, you focused on Cuban media a lot, especially in the mid 20th century. This is something that I had the privilege of learning about. I didn't really have exposure to this, though I'm Cuban and Venezuelan. So what about Cuban media drew you to it?
So if you talk to people from Latin America, people who were part of the beginning of television, all of them will tell you. I'm talking about specifically people who work in the industry,
Mhm.
that the model of television that they follow was Cuban. The only country in Latin America that actually follow a different model, meaning because of course all Latin America follow the US commercial model, and then Cuba like adapted the model
Mm.
and the programming, etc. The only country that didn't follow that was Colombia, which actually had public broadcasting, which was not common. Venezuela at the beginning also had public broadcasting, but then it switched. So talking to people, I was so mesmerized, like, oh my God, how is it possible that no one has written about this if everybody talks about it? Everybody knows like that Cuba was so key in the development of television in Latin America. My first book was about representations of Blackness on Puerto Rican television, and I interviewed many people who work in the industry. They all passed already, but many of them were Cuban because, of course, after the revolution, they went all over.
Mhm.
And I said, you know what? How is it possible that no one has written about this, and that instead, and that happens in many cases with media studies. Media studies is an area that focuses on the present. So because Cuba right now, and for many years, has not been the center of television, so people don't
Mhm.
focus on that. They focus on Mexico, which is, or actually Venezuela, not anymore, but Mexico, which actually dominated, or Brazil. So that
Mhm.
is why I decided to write a book about Cuban television. And indeed, it was very developed because of the investments, U.S. investment in Cuba. There was a connection with specifically NBC in the U.S. But yeah, that's why. That is why. And if you think about it, they excel in radio production and like radio novelas, telenovelas. They dominated the exportation of scripts around
Mhm.
Latin America, and also advertising. So if you
Mhm.
think about the beginning of advertising in the US, Latino, focusing on Spanish language advertising, that was Cubans who migrated. And of course,
Oh.
if you think about, for example, how is it possible, like the propaganda campaigns in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, they were magnificent, of course, because they were like, these people were trained in advertising. So,
Right.
yeah. And in Venezuela, of course, many of them migrated there and they work in
Mhm.
television. So that's why I'm always interested in telling stories that no one has told.
Right.
In academia, not because everybody outside knows, but in academia, it's more difficult to do that because you have to begin from scratch. But at the same time, it's fascinating when you finish it, even though it takes you a long time because you're telling something new.
These are stories that I feel like my grandma has probably told me a little bit about that. She left right before the revolution, but I can't say that I had heard of any of these stories prior or in such depth as is laid out in your research. Did you note or research how there was a shift in the media in Cuba after the revolution, so post 59?
So I think the book ends 60-61. So that's like the switch, the shift. It was huge. So, for example, they eliminated the soap operas because they were like a symbol of U.S. imperialism. They came back later, but they eliminated the variety shows. So, yes, they followed the USSR, the Russian model of propaganda, and TV was extremely important for the creation of a new idea of a nation. And so all the programs, everything was focusing on that. How do you actually convince these, the audiences, the citizens, that they have to change? And it's through propaganda, like TV was key. So I discussed that, but there was, like, let me be clear, the people in Cuba were very helpful and very friendly to me, but I stopped with the revolution. And I stopped with the revolution because I thought that they were not going to share the Did they have it, by the way? That would be amazing, but they were not, I think that they were not going to share the information, not to mention that can I have the information and then be critical? I don't think so. So yeah, there was a change, a shift, huge.
And given that Florida, especially South Florida, is now home to such a large population of Cuban Americans, one would think that Cubans have heavily influenced media within the state. Have you found this to be true?
So they were highly influential. The beginning, well, again, and Arlene Davila's Latinos Inc. book talks about advertising. They were behind the boom, the advertising boom, like focusing on the Latino communities in the United States, specifically focusing on Spanish language. I'm sorry, that's my email. Spanish language media. So, like in the work that I'm trying to do right now, one thing that happens, if you think about Miami, they call it like the capital of Latin America. And you think about Univision, Telemundo, but specifically Univision, which is connected to Televisa in Mexico for many years in terms of programming, etc. But I have discovered that many of the Cubans, they migrated to Miami. And what happened is like the US began to use these Cuban people, media professionals, to create propaganda campaigns for the Latin American market. They did that with radio. They also hired people in Mexico to create films focusing on, like to fight communism across Latin America. So I'm giving you this background because what I'm trying to say is like when you think about Miami as a media capital, it's not the 80s or the 90s. You have to go back to the 60s, the Cuban migration. They began to develop Spanish language radio in Miami. Okay. For example, this is like the project that I'm working on right now. There was a very important media production company that was producing radio novelas for the Spanish language market with Cuban actors and Cuban scriptwriters and Cuban directors. So yes, they were extremely important, specifically Miami, to tell you the truth. Although they also influence New York City with the Puerto Ricans, then you have another market with the Mexican Americans and Mexicans. And you see it, I think still today, of course, today you have like Venezuelans and Colombians in Miami, but yep.
And so an issue that comes into play when examining this media as a whole, as you've spoken about, is the issue of racism. So as Latinx Spanish language media has begun to develop in the United States, how is this something that's being addressed?
So to tell you the truth, I don't have the Spanish language package. I don't watch, I don't, I haven't been, I don't watch Univision and Telemundo anymore. I think in terms of race, what I have observed is that in those shows that I mentioned in English, that deal with Latino families, they have addressed, like maybe one episode, they address racism, they address it, or they address the struggles of migrations, all of that. But in the Spanish language media, I haven't, because I haven't kept up. Everything that I watch right now is in English when I have time. Uh, because, because I enjoy it. Because I enjoy it. I haven't watched a telenovela in years. So I'm sorry that I cannot answer that question, but the changes that I have seen are in English language media. And mainly because you have people behind the scenes, which is so important. You have Latinx people behind the scene working, like trying to make a difference.
Do the lived experiences of Latinx people, especially behind the scenes in writers' rooms and production teams, have their experiences had the power to change plot points or narratives being told on shows and movies?
I think so. If they have, again, writers' rooms are so important. If they have access to get into a writer's room, I think indeed they can actually make a difference in the way characters are developed, topics that are addressed. I think that is why I think when people think about representation, they think about actors. And yes, it's important. But I think it's extremely important to have people as writers, like Latinx people as writers, as directors, but the writers are the most, in terms of television, the writers are key. Movies are more complex because you have, like a couple of writers, but TV, I think there is a potential for difference.
Your chapter in Contemporary Latino Media Production, Circulation, and Politics, titled Anatomy of a Protest, Grey's Anatomy, Colombia's A Corazón Abierto, and the Politicization of a Format, spoke to the racism scene in Colombia. As you wrote, Shonda Rhimes, creator of Grey's Anatomy, is known to incorporate diverse actors in all of the shows that she creates, including Black actors. In Colombia, there is a significant population and community of Afro-descendants. What did it mean for them to be excluded from the remake of a show with Black medical doctors put at the forefront as protagonists?
So based on, again, the research, I did that research like many years ago, but I remember the commentary, like they were offended, especially like the activists, because when they saw that they were going to adapt Grey's Anatomy, because of course they're familiar with the US show, and they knew that there were many Black people, black characters, important Black characters, because of course that's Shonda Rhimes. So they were in total shock when they eliminated the Black characters from the Colombian version. And then they said, some people behind the, in the production, that there were not many Black doctors. I don't know where, like there is no data, like, where did they get that from? I don't know. So that was a major controversy in Colombia. But again, I was not that surprised because that happens a lot in many Latin American countries. Anti-Black racism is something very prevalent in Latin America and in Latino communities in the United States. That's a fact. It's like, they come from Latin America with those prejudices, and then you add the Black and white dichotomy, racial dichotomy that characterizes the United States. So you have another level of anti-Black racism, which is different from the one that it comes from Latin America, of course, like the ingrained in the culture. It actually sometimes sadly solidifies it. So yeah, it was sad, but I was not surprised.
Did you notice that Black people historically have been erased from certain media, shows, movies within Latin America?
Yes, for sure. They played the maid. The only, maids that's like in the novelas, in the soap operas, the only country that, in my opinion, had, because they have been struggling for a long time, and they have a lot of activists, is Brazil. But yes, it's incredible. The racism is very prevalent. Again, Brazil have made some changes. And here in the United States, I think many academics right now are dealing with that subject, anti-Black racism within the Latino community. That's a very hot topic right now because they're usually, put aside. But that is why, for example, the fact, like, if you see someone like the actress who play Anita in West Side Story, she's Puerto Rican and Black, and she's actually, Afro-Latina. She constantly talks about that. But yeah, I think here, there is an erasure. In the United States is different. I think they're more, again, there are more pressure. You have pressure like community activism. In Latin America, not that much. Except, again, you have Brazil. I think Colombia also have a very strong, right now, activism against racism.
And the show A Corazón Abierto, as we just spoke about, was a reimagined version of Grey's Anatomy. This came after the failure of Desperate Housewives being translated and reproduced instead of being adapted. What did this show's failure tell large media companies and networks about the Latinx community and the Latin American community?
Well, I think that was in a time when they thought that just translating a script was possible and just like putting in, you put people speaking Spanish and that's it without any contextualization. They learned their lesson, by the way. That's why we, even in the United States, when we get adapted, like The Office, the show The Office is from England. They adapted it.
Right.
So they learned the same. The same goes on in any country. You need to adapt. You cannot just translate the scripts, because if you don't adapt and talk to the culture, the people's culture, like, they're not gonna watch. Who cares? So I think that's what they learned, and that was at the beginning. Like, the format exporting was like booming in terms of global TV, and now it's evident that they always make those changes. And I think about, well, you can see it, for example, more familiar. Betty La Fea, the adaptation of the Colombian telenovela Ugly Betty, which is totally different from the original. But I think what is important is that they decided to cast a Mexican American. She has like a poncho at the beginning. So they decided to adapt it to the realities of the US. Even something that in some ways would have been similar because it comes from a Latin American country, from Colombia, etc. But yes, so that is the main difference. The change, I think all the media producers understood that it was important to make if you want to be successful financially.
And it seems as though American companies try to make palatable media for a broad audience base. Does this impact the quality and authenticity of the media that they end up producing?
I think so, but again, that's what I'm so surprised in the recent trend of specificity. I would have never, I would have never imagined seeing a show about the Dominican family on HBO. Like, like, it's a show that you can see on NBC, CBS, doesn't have bad, like, if you think about HBO, is mostly crosses the boundary in terms of sexuality, in terms of language, in terms of nudity, etc. And this is a very traditional in the sense of, the format of the situation comedy. But I think it's impressive what is happening. It's like very, very specific instead of generalizing. Again, I don't know how long that's going to last.
Right.
But the fact that they are giving opportunities to those people, and the same with the adaptation of Father of the Bride.
I haven't seen it yet. I have it on my list of movies to watch.
It's okay. It's not that.
It's not that good.
Well, I didn't like it that much, but that's my taste. But yeah, my God, it's like the third or fourth time that it has been adapted. But this is the first time that it's adapted to Miami Cuban family. So I think it was interesting that it was a Cuban family and then who married a Mexican, not Mexican American, Mexican. So yeah, there is this shift.
And now for the final question that I have for you, if you could go back in time to when you were in high school or in your undergrad experience, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
What would I give myself? I think not to be disappointed by some things don't come. Sometimes, like, you do things and you don't get what you expected. So not to be disappointed because you have a long life and other things will come through. Of course, I never imagined that I was going to be a professor. That is a fact. And to follow, I think that some doors close, se cierran, las puertas se cierran, las puertas se abren. I think uno tiene que ir, like, follow the path that actually, you see, sometimes things are easier for you, but you don't understand that life itself is opening up another door and being brave enough to follow that path, even though you don't know what is going to happen. And in my case, I never imagined, never in my life that I was going to be, I never imagined, never that I was going to write books, never. I never imagined that I was going to be a college professor. Mm-mm. And of course, I never imagined that I was going to be chair. So yeah, it's to work hard. I used to work hard, but continue to work hard and then try different things.
Thank you so much, Professor Rivero. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the advice, all of your stories, your research. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Un
Thank
placer.
you. Un placer. Gracias.